Well, I am very honored to be here today, and the topic of my presentation will be from whom to source information in a complex world. And this is built in the transdisciplinary notion of informing science, which looks at informing processes in a very general way, not limited to instruction, but informing in business, informing between information systems and humans, and informing in casual social settings. And so what we're really looking for is the commonalities that bring together fields like education, communications, information systems, management, and so forth. Now, for today's presentation, I will be focusing on first the problem of informing under complexity. I'm going to spend most of my emphasis on this because I think it's a very challenging problem. And as we talk about things like rules for effective instruction, Dr. Hendel's talk, one of the things you find is under complexity, a lot of those rules become very, very hard to implement. Then I will talk about the challenge of sourcing information. Nowadays we hear a lot about things like fake news, and it's an interesting question. As the world becomes more complex, as things become more dynamic, where should we look for information? And then finally I will introduce an exploratory informing framework. This is a work in progress, dealing with questions like how, when the environment changes, might we change the sources of information that we're looking for. So, the initial problem we'll be talking about is informing under complexity. Now that immediately creates another problem, which is, what is complexity? Well, there are lots and lots of definitions of complexity, so I'm going to be talking about a very specific type of complexity whose dependent variable is the notion of fitness, something which I've really drawn from evolutionary biology. So when we talk about fitness in biological terms, what we're interested in is understanding how an organism or species survives and reproduces. And when we talk about the individual organism, we're talking about survival, which we can look at basically as the likelihood that the organism will survive between two periods. When we talk about reproduction, we're normally talking about a group of organisms, and then the question becomes, is that set of organisms going to grow or shrink over the period? Well, the same notion of fitness has been applied to informing, particularly with the concept of a meme, which actually came out of the genetics research area, and basically the fitness of an idea. So the likelihood that an idea will survive from period to period is a survival concept. As many of you have probably encountered, there is no guarantee that a student's ability to answer a question on a test will survive 2 weeks later. Similarly, reproduction deals with the ability of that idea to be shared, to gain credence, or to disappear over time. And I think maybe the easiest way to illustrate this is with an example. Suppose we define a set of people who believe in ghosts, and our fitness measure in this case will be a ratio of how that number of people changes. So if at time t0, 100 people believe in ghosts, if we expect the belief in ghosts to decline over time, fitness will be less than 1. So if we think that 80 people will believe in the next period, you'll have 0.8 as your fitness. If we expect the belief in ghosts to increase over time, then fitness will be greater than 1. So if we expect 110 people to believe in the next period, then fitness would be 1.1. And so fitness basically becomes a measure of whether things are growing or declining within a set, but within an individual, it's limited to one. You either have that concept or you don't have that concept in the next period, or there's a certain expected value that you will have that concept. Okay, so now once we understand that fitness is our dependent variable, then we can define something that we'll call complexity. And extrinsic complexity is what I call this to distinguish it from other types of complexity. And it's really the nature of the relationship determining fitness. And it's basically a continuum ranging from the highly decomposable to the highly complex or highly rugged. And I think an easiest way to think about this is to think about how we might look at the fitness of the contents of a test versus the fitness of the contents of a cookbook. Now, in a typical multiple choice test, you might have 20 questions. And of those 20 questions, for each of them there will be a right answer. Yes, this is a very simple test. Now, your most fit value, the one that you would keep doing over and over again if you always got it, is 100%, all 20 questions right. But what's interesting about this type of fitness is all other things being equal, you will always do better if question 17 is answered correctly versus question 17 being answered incorrectly. Same is true of question 12 and question 5 and all the other questions, because each question adds to fitness independently. Now, think about, at the other extreme, the relationship between ingredients and the recipes of a cookbook. A cookbook is basically a collection of recipes, and each one has a set of ingredients. Now, in the case of a test, we can ask the question, is the right answer on question 17 good or bad? And the answer is, it's good, always. In a cookbook, if we ask the same question, is garlic a good ingredient? What's the answer? It depends. If you're making a dish with lamb, yeah, garlic is almost always a good ingredient. If you're making desserts, on the whole, I tend to avoid it. There is a restaurant in San Francisco called the Stinking Rose where they add garlic to everything. Appetizers, wonderful. Entrees, wonderful. Go next door for dessert, because garlic-flavored ice cream is a novelty. You can't really make it taste great. So, in this world, fitness is determined by combinations of attributes, and as a consequence, you have lots and lots of local peaks. In fact, if you look at a cookbook, every recipe is the author's conception of a local peak, because a peak is simply a place where any incremental change produces a lower fitness. Well, if the author thought you could do better with half a teaspoon of cinnamon instead of a quarter a teaspoon of cinnamon, the author would have put a half a teaspoon of cinnamon in the cookbook. So each recipe represents a peak. Now, what that means is when you look at a complex world, it looks radically different visually than a simple extrinsic complexity world. In a decomposable world, each attribute that contributes to fitness adds independently, and you can basically step your way up to fitness relatively easily because there is going to be only one peak. In a highly complex world, you have a very rugged landscape with lots and lots of local peaks, like the recipes. And a tiny change in one variable can produce a big impact on all your overall fitness. Again, using the recipe analogy, if you take out the baking powder from a cake recipe, you no longer produce a cake, you produce construction material. Hard, dense, you can build with it. Yet you'll almost never find anyone who says, I bake the best cakes because I use the best baking powder. Yet this little ingredient has a huge impact on fitness, as do most of the other ingredients in the cake. So sometimes very little changes can produce huge drop-offs, which is why I use Bryce Canyon as my illustration for highly rugged landscapes. You know, you take a little step and it's not like a gradual drop like it is with the pyramid, it's a big drop. Or it might have no effect at all. That's the challenge of ruggedness. So, we now turn to the question of informing, and as I talked about, an idea has a certain fitness, and when we're informing someone, or equally important, when someone decides to become informed, you can look at it as a process. You have an initial fitness of that, which hopefully is a little bit less than 1, because if the fitness is 1, they're not moving. What you then have to do is take them on a journey. And part of that journey means abandoning the original notion before we fully digested the new notion. We're in a very, very low fitness state then. We want to move out of that state very quickly because we're just confused. Then we move up, we grasp the new idea, but we're not sure how good it is. If we're not careful, we'll go right back up here. And then eventually, hopefully, we'll end up at this higher level of fitness. And the problem is this higher level of fitness is obscured in a cloud, because in a very complex environment, you don't necessarily know if this idea is going to be that useful for you. As instructors, we try to motivate this. I think the best instructors try and convince people why this is going to be useful for them in their later career. The easy way out is to say, well, it's going to be a lot easier for you in your career if you get an A in this course instead of a C, and then we can use grades as a motivation. But of course, if we use grades as a motivation, as soon as the grade has been delivered, the student has a huge incentive to move right back to the original idea. Introductory physics courses have a huge problem convincing people the rules of physics according to Aristotle don't apply. There have been studies of this. And so if you're not very careful, after they've gone through that introductory physics course, if you ask them, will a big ball fall faster than a small ball of the same material, they'll say yes, even though Galileo showed that that was not the case. That's not the way gravity works. Now, when we look at that transition, you can have the informer-driven perspective. And as faculty members, we almost always think from the informer-driven perspective. So the question is, okay, where is our client, the student, starting out? Because it's very hard to teach someone if you don't know where they're starting out. What information do I need to convey? How can I scaffold the problem to make that transition from one peak to another peak as short and painless as possible? And then, how do I get the client to move to that target state? So this deals with actually 3 different types of complexity. But remember, the learning process has a different side, and that's the client's side. And the client's question begins, am I ready to be informed? Do I even want to take this journey? How often do you hear from students in calculus, well, I'm never going to use this. All I need to do is score well enough on the test. Do I want to end up at this new knowledge point, or is it not the worth? And then, of course, how do I get there? Because from the student's point of view, this is a personal journey. Now, under high extrinsic complexity, remember that there are multiple peaks, and these peaks have sharp drop-offs. Now, what this means as a practical view is when you're dealing with high extrinsic complexity landscapes, you can expect to see certain behaviors. First off, tiny differences in state can exert a huge impact on fitness. That's the baking powder example. And what that means is we're very, very reluctant to relinquish an old idea until we're absolutely certain the idea that we're exchanging it for is better. I did a study looking at beliefs in witchcraft versus beliefs in alchemy. And those two beliefs were almost universal in the Middle Ages. Now, what has happened since then is that belief in alchemy has declined significantly. Why? Because we have a substitute belief. The rules of physics and chemistry will substitute for alchemy and do a better job of predicting. In the US population, more than 60% of the people in the US still believe in witchcraft in some form or another. Why is that? Probably because we still haven't explained the answer to questions like, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do some things seem to happen at random? Witchcraft provides an answer to that. It isn't a very useful answer because it doesn't provide any ability to predict. But we don't really have a satisfactory answer for that, and so the belief in witchcraft has been much, much harder to dislodge. Now, different regions of the landscape can operate on entirely different rules. What that means is that we encourage the formation of silos because if we get a group of people working on the same fitness peak, the same rules apply to everybody. If they're working on opposite fitness peaks or different fitness peaks, you can have entirely different rules. Adding garlic in one fitness peak makes it better. Adding garlic in another makes it much worse. And that encourages silos. The whole truth also becomes unmanageable. You can show from an information theory point of view that the amount of information necessary to handle a 20-bit landscape is 20 units of information if it's decomposable. If it's completely complex, random, you need 1,000,000 units of information to store the whole thing. So the whole truth, you simply can't work with it. In environments that are highly extrinsically complex, the behavior of other agents provides a key source of fitness because you can't figure them out per se. You have to observe what's happening to other people. That way, if so-and-so wears a tie and gets more respect, well, if that person's like me, then maybe I'll wear a tie the next time. I don't have to run the experiment myself. Finally, the behavior of other agents impacts the fitness relationship. Because what happens is if you see people are successful by believing a certain thing, then what you will do is you will assume that belief, provided the people are like you. As a result, we have fitness being very dynamic and prone to information cascades, fads, fashions, and so forth. Because fitness doesn't advertise itself. So this leads to a series of scenarios. One instructional scenario is where you've got a homogeneous client. They're all starting at the same peak and going to a very clear target. That's a great scenario for something like lecture. You can design a lecture to move people from one place to another because they're all coming from the same place. It gets a little harder when you've got a diverse set of clients going to a single peak. When I teach introductory programming, I want everybody to share a common understanding of loops and branches and variables and data types and stuff like that. But my students would come in with vastly different levels of experience. Half of them would never have had a programming course. A quarter of them would have had one programming course before mine. A quarter of them would have had 2 or more programming courses before mine. So what I tried to do there was deal with a self-paced programming course. The problem is this particular layer is a simpler layer because you're looking for a common understanding. Where it gets really messy is where the people who are being informed are looking for different targets. So what might something like this look like? Well, this is the picture of the Harvard Business School class of 1963. What do you immediately notice when you look at this class? How many genders are represented? How many people don't have a tie? 0. How many people aren't wearing a jacket? 0. Really, the big difference is some of them wear glasses and some of them don't. Now, I would argue within this group, they would tell you how different everyone is, because when we're within a group of self-similar individuals, we focus on our differences. But one of the challenges that business faced in the late 50s and early 60s was dealing with a tendency towards conformity. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit was a popular movie. The Organization Man was a popular book. One of the ideas behind the case method is to force people to come up with different solutions to the same problem. Think about the problem in different ways. And during the 1960s, the case method was widely adopted across business schools because this was the problem they were trying to solve. I would argue, however, when we look at today's typical class, we don't have any kind of uniformity among our students, and they're all targeting different peaks. Now, as an instructor, I cannot guide them through all the different paths, because if I have a class of 30 students, there are 30 different starting points, 30 different targets. That's 900 possible paths. There's no way I can take control of that class, which means that greater responsibility for informing necessarily falls on the client. Where extrinsic complexity is very high, experience often fails. Past experience is not so much a guide, which basically leads to the problem. Where will the client go to find information? So, I moved to this problem, and this is a very difficult one to answer, and I'm not going to be able to give you a complete solution. By the way, anyone who's seen my instructional techniques knows the answer to every question I pose is it depends. But let me say that the first thing I need to do is come up with a way of distinguishing different landscapes. We've already talked about rugged and decomposable, but even within very rugged landscapes, which is what I'm interested in, there are some classifications which I have found to be useful in thinking about where the informing should come from. The first is survivability. Some landscapes are very bountiful. They're full of high fitness peaks. Other landscapes are hostile. There are a lot of peaks, but most of them have relatively low fitness, which means you don't survive on them very long. Another characteristic is maturity. How well do we understand the structure of the landscape? When you start talking with brand new product innovations, you really have no idea what the landscape's going to look like. When Apple introduced the iPod, the convenient narrative is they understood that the consumers exactly wanted this. But I would argue there was an equally big chance, probably a much greater chance, that consumers would have looked at that funny dial thing and said, well, why would I want to do that? The point is, the only way you can find that out is by putting it out into the landscape. On the other hand, there are some landscapes that are relatively well understood. If you look at the electric power landscape, for example, there's, it hasn't been changing that radically over time, though even now that could be disrupted. Finally, there's the question of focus. And we can get kind of technical there, but it really has to do with the sharpness of peaks. If you've got very sharp peaks, then what you need to do is you have to focus very narrowly on the local landscape. If your peaks are a little more forgiving, or if you're occupying multiple peaks at the same time, and that makes sense, then you can have a broader focus. Now, as a general rule, and let me tell you, there are plenty of exceptions to this, bountiful landscapes tend to become hostile over time. Immature landscapes tend to become mature over time. Broad focus tends to yield to narrow focus, which is why in a lot of our older industries we have, 3 or 4 big competitors, and the little competitors don't really make much difference. And I would argue the same thing happens, say, when you talk about someone's progression in an academic career. You start out with lots of opportunities, and do I want to become a professor? There are just so many choices. Then as you start to sort out the careers, you find yourself competing with other people. Take a look at pre-meds, and you will know that competition highly... And if you take a look at the academic process, we have a process that's designed to not so much build people up as weed them out. Hey, we fire them after 6 years if they don't get tenure. We're very, very selective. It's really hard to get that position anymore. You start out with an immature understanding of the landscape. Well, what's this all going to be like? And by the time you're a full professor, you've become incredibly jaundiced, much like me. Our research originally, you can't, you're interested in researching these big questions across lots of areas. You want to do interdisciplinary. You get that pounded out of you in the course of your career. And by the time you're through, you're down in a very narrow focus within the area that you're comfortable with. Now, there are plenty of exceptions, and things like disruptive innovations can move you back on this timeline. It can totally disrupt the landscape, and all of a sudden it's immature again, and you have to deal with all these other issues. But I would say this is a sort of a typical progression. Now, how do we classify sources on the landscape? And I'm down to 5 minutes, so I'll move relatively quickly. I would argue the first thing we can do is classify sources as being internal to the agent, whether it's an individual or an organization, or external. Internal sources might be internal databases. If you're an organization, it might be employees. Past experience, reasoning, stuff we can do from inside. Whereas external involves interaction with outside agents, competing peers, your social peers, suppliers and customers for a business, advisors, instructors and trainers, regulators. These are all external sources of information you can go to. And in trying to classify them, what my proposition is we could break them up according to whether they impact our fitness landscape directly or whether they do not impact our fitness landscape. So can they change the landscape? And this one is, are they affected by the landscape and can they change the landscape? So limited ability to change the landscape means they can see the landscape, but they can't do anything about it. Impacting significant ability means that they can actually change the landscape. And I just tossed some names on these. An observer is not impacted by or does not impact the landscape. A participant is impacted by the landscape but doesn't have necessarily the ability to change it. A peer faces a similar landscape to the agent being informed. A facilitator can change the landscape but is not directly affected by it. And just to point out, this is a continuum. An influencer can be a little bit of all of these different things. So to sort of make a more concrete example, let's take a sporting a game, say a football game, a U.S. football game. The competing athletes are peers. They both affect and are affected by the landscape. The coaches are influencers. They're affected by the landscape and they can affect the landscape, but they're not affected in the same way. They're not going to be charged at by a 300-pound behemoth. Your fans, vendors, and advertisers are participants. They're emotionally affected by the landscape, their business is affected by the landscape, but they can't directly influence the game. Referees and umpires, on the other hand, can influence the game, but they should not be affected by the way the game turns out. And your broadcast reporters, they're observers. They should not be affected by the game. They should not affect the game. So the question is, where do you go for information? So I've got some broad generalizations. The first thing is that where you've got broad focus, you're going to have a large information need, which means you're going to have to rely heavily on external sources. Where you've got a narrow focus, which tends to occur over time, your information need is going to be much more limited, and you can rely more heavily on internal sources. So that's one distinction. Immature landscape, the most pressing need is to gather more information. Mature landscapes, the information is largely available, so your information need is not as great. In survivability and bountiful landscapes, you're not worried about competing agents. You're willing to share. Hostile landscapes, you want to avoid disclosing too much about your survivable position because there aren't that many survivable positions there. So, basically what I would argue is in the start of some landscapes, where that brand new landscape comes out, really peers, you have to rely most heavily on external agents, particularly peers, and you're willing to exchange information with them. I would argue this is the reason why in some of the high-tech industries you get collections of peers working together in places like the Silicon Valley, around university towns. They exchange information. As the landscape moves to the hostile, mature landscape, you're going to rely much more heavily on your internal information. And one of the things that you are likely to do is be informed by folks who cannot directly impact your landscape, your facilitators, your influencers, and your observers. Now, an interesting case is the bountiful, mature landscape. This landscape would not normally exist in a perfectly competitive world. However, it can exist if the facilitators force it to exist. And so, for example, when you look at highly regulated industries, the goal of the agents is not so much to be informed, but is to inform the facilitators why they should continue putting up barriers to entry. You see the insurance companies now trying to inform the government about what regulations should be put in place to preserve them right now. Basically, this is called rent extraction. I just heard, for example, that New York wants to put a minimum wage requirement on Uber drivers, but not on taxi cab drivers. Why? Because they want to preserve the bountiful nature that taxi cab drivers had for a long time. It used to be a medallion in New York was worth over $1 million. So, let's see here. I guess I forgot to click on this. And then all right, come on. Okay, summary. As complexity grows, the client becomes more responsible for informing. So the question becomes where to go when you're informed. The nature of a landscape should impact the most appropriate source, and I would argue the two dimensions that I found useful in thinking about this is bountiful versus hostile, immature versus mature. Finally, the decisions you need to make involve choosing between external and internal sources, and then figuring out what external sources you want to use depending upon the roles. And with that, I will stop. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I'd run a few moments over. And thank you all very much. Questions at the end.